So in this presentation, I want to offer a quick solution maybe to the issue of how Adventism should be relating to critical scholarship. Now, higher criticism, critical scholarship, it's something that for Adventism, it's been kind of a problem in the past, and the traditional stance has been that Adventists use the historical grammatical method, not the historical critical method. And that's kind of been the way that a lot of our theologians have responded to the issue. But really what that's saying is more or less that we're fundamentalists. I mean, it's just a way of putting us in a corner and letting the world know that our position is not academically viable. So I don't think it's a good strategy to say that we're completely rejecting the historical critical method. I think there's a better way to think about this. So I'm going to use a quick analogy as a way to think about critical scholarship and how we should engage or interact with this element within theology. So I think there's a better way to go about this thing. So the analogy goes something like this. So imagine that somebody comes to you and says, hey, I have evidence that your spouse is having an affair. Okay, so they sit you down and they have a pile of evidence, and they start presenting this evidence to you one by one. So imagine that there's one piece of evidence on every sheet of paper, and they put on a sheet of paper, you look over it, then the second sheet of paper, and they just keep piling up evidence. Now imagine in this scenario that there's a third person nearby, an unbiased third party. So essentially somebody that just happens to be there and they're listening to the conversation, and they don't know you, they don't know your spouse, they don't know this person that's accusing your spouse, they don't know anything. They're just judging the situation based entirely on the evidence. Okay, so imagine in this scenario that this person starts to pile up evidence one piece at a time. Now we could put this in a graph and say, okay, the more and more evidence is accumulated, the more likely it is that the person is right and your spouse is having an affair. However, there are different thresholds at which you and that stranger, that third party individual, will rationally come to the conclusion that the evidence is compelling. So because this unbiased third party, they don't know anything about you, they don't know anything about your wife, they don't know anything about your situation, they're going to listen to this person presenting the evidence. And as the evidence piles up, they're going to get to a point where they're going to say, oh, okay, I think it's enough. I think the evidence is sufficient for me to conclude that this is, in fact, in this situation, in fact, the spouse really is having an affair. But you're not in the same position as this unbiased third party. You actually know your wife or your husband. You know who they are. You know that you could trust them. You know that you've had a life experience with them, so you have a lot more trust for this person than this third party individual has. So for you, the level of evidence is a little bit higher. So the person will have to keep piling up evidence, but then there comes a point where even you reach a threshold and you say, okay, if you're rational and reasonable, then you're going to say, okay, I think the evidence is sufficient. And if beyond that threshold, you continue to refuse to believe it, then you're becoming unreasonable. You're being gullible. You're being, you're not following the evidence where it leads. Okay, so essentially, because one person doesn't know anything about the situation, so they're essentially kind of an outside observer, and because you do know a lot about the situation, the threshold of evidence is different for these two parties. Okay, so having said that, I want to make a statement about where things are today in terms of the philosophy in general, where the world of philosophy is at. I think the image is being covered up by my graphics, or my graphic is being covered up by my picture here, but I don't think anything substantial is missing. Okay, so in this picture, I show the three phases that kind of things went through over the past several centuries and millennia. So before the Enlightenment period, we call that pre-modernity. At that time, you might say that metaphysics kind of superseded science, or you could even say religion superseded science. So essentially, people arrived at their conclusions through philosophy and through theology, and then they evaluated the results of science based on how it fit with their theology and how it fit with their metaphysical paradigms. So science was basically subservient to metaphysics. But then there was a flip during the Enlightenment. So once we entered the modern period, around the 1600s, where people lost faith in metaphysics, they lost faith in the old way of doing things. So now science became dominant. And if you wanted to do theology, already theology was considered an inferior way of knowing. But if you did want to continue to do theology, you had at least you were at least obligated to try to fit your theology around the findings of science. So whatever this scientists believed to be the case, then you had to kind of adapt your theology to fit with that, because science had epistemic priority. Now move forward towards the end of the 20th century, and we've entered something, basically the postmodern period. And within the realm of science and philosophy, one of the key figures here is Thomas Kuhn, who introduced this idea that science goes through a series of paradigms. And we exist in one paradigm and we see things a certain way, and then there's like a paradigm shift and things change and we have a very different outlook on reality. So the result of that was that this idea of epistemic priority for science was kind of changed, and now science is more on the same level with other forms of knowing. So we're kind of, and we haven't fully developed this process yet. We're still kind of in this process. It's a recent shift, but we're moving towards a time when science and other forms of knowing are kind of evening out. So within this context, what I'm proposing is that we can think of critical scholarship as essentially applying scientific principles to the subject matter of theology. However, we can actually approach it as having these two different levels, or these two different thresholds. Now, before I finish my point with that, I want to introduce one more thought here. I've mentioned quite a bit in previous videos and presentations that there are different theoretical models in Christian theology. And some of the biggest ones, the most popular ones, are the Catholic Orthodox model, the Protestant, the New Orthodox, the Liberal. And I've argued that Adventism has its own model. Now, a lot of times people are uneasy when they hear that, because they say, well, Adventists are Protestants. But what I mean by this is that Adventism has belongs to kind of a different strain of Protestantism than mainstream Protestantism, because we kind of followed the radical Reformation, people like the Anabaptists and others that are different from, the mainstream reformers like Luther and Calvin. So we have a different epistemology from mainstream Protestantism. And because of that, we actually should be categorized as a different model here. So we have these different theoretical models in Christian theology, and each one has its own logical structure, and it has a different way of reasoning through its systematic vision or view of reality. And each one of these models has certain elements that are critical to its theological system and other elements that are not so critical. And the way they interact with science, if they come across something that's not critical and science seems to contradict with that, they say, okay, this is not a critical element to my theology. I can change it because it seems to contradict with science. But if there's a critical element and that one seems to contradict with science, the way they interact is by following this dual threshold that I'm showing in this graphic. And it's basically each one of these groups that follows this method is not just Adventist. And all I'm saying is that Adventists could follow a similar strategy that any of these other groups do. So basically, the idea is that different groups, they have different critical elements. So for example, for maybe somebody who's New Orthodox, there might be some element in theology that seems to contradict with science, and to them it's not a big deal because it's not a critical element in their theology. So then they follow this particular threshold because this is not a serious issue. But then as you come to a different element that's more critical, and if for whatever reason the scientific evidence seems to point in a different direction, then they say no, we need an additional level of evidence to get rid of that component because that's critical to our system. Okay, so science has to operate at this sort of unbiased threshold. Science essentially is just stepping back and saying we're just looking at the facts. We don't know anything else. But we're operating from within these theoretical models. And like I mentioned before, within postmodernity, the theoretical models are a lot more balanced with science as opposed to science dominating over them like it did even 2, 3, 4 decades ago and for the past several centuries. So when it comes to Adventism can follow that same approach. We can interact with critical scholarship and we can say, okay, they seem to contradict some pieces of our theology, but those are not critical to our system. We could adapt, we could modify them, whatever. But then they conflict with other elements in our theology that are critical, and we could say, okay, it seems like there's a conflict here, but what is the level of evidence? So let's go back and evaluate, and let's see if the evidence is sufficient to reach this higher threshold. And if it is, then we need to take it seriously. Otherwise, we could just take the same kind of exception that any of the other models take when it comes to critical scholarship in those areas that are critical to their system. So this is kind of an outlook, a strategy, a way of thinking about critical scholarship that allows us to engage with it as opposed to simply dismissing it and kind of putting ourselves in a corner and saying we're just like all the fundamentalists who essentially have our head in the sand and we're refusing to interact with scientific evidence.